Bore da pawb. Welcome to this session of the Wales Biodiversity Conference. This session is on restoring resilient habitats. Our first presentation, just let me get it up. Sorry, I'm kind of struggling with the technology and having various things open at the same time. Just to introduce myself, I'm Sue Hearn. I'm team leader for freshwater ecosystems and fisheries management in Natural Resources Wales, Cyfoeth and Shuriel Cymru. So our first presentation today is from Gethin Davies from Snowdonia National Park, Helen Upson from RSPB Cymru, and Hilary Kehoe from Pont Cymru. This is on Celtic Rainforests Wales project. Part of this session will be in Welsh, so there will be a simultaneous translation for that part in English, and that will be available on the phone number that Michaela has very helpfully put underneath this in the chat box. So, dan ni'n barod dwi'n meddwl rŵan, so croeso I Gethin, Helen ac Hilary.
Sorry, Gethin, you're just muted a second. Do you want to unmute your microphone?
Diolch Sw. Fel Sw'n deud, Gethin Davies enw I, dwi'n rheoli'r prosiect coedwigoedd glaw Celtaidd Cymru ar ran awdurdod Parc Cenedlaethol Eryri a'r partneriaeth pellach. Fyddwch chi hefyd yn clywed gan hydweithiwr Helen Upson sydd hefyd yn gweithio ar y prosiect. Hi wedi swyddog pori y prosiect. A Hilary Kehoe o Pont Cymru sydd yn cydweithio hefo ni ar yr elfen pori o'r prosiect yn eitha agos chi. Felly, jyst I reid ryw gyflwyniad sydyn iawn I chi ar y cynefin. So mae'r coedwigoedd glaw Celtaidd yn rhan o biom byd-eang y coedwigoedd glaw tymherus. Maen nhw'n cael I ddarganfod ar arfordir gorllewinol Gogledd De America, arfordir gorllewinol Ewrop sydd yn ffinio hefo môr yr Iwerydd chi, felly yn Prydain o'r Alban trwy Werddon ochr gorllewinol Cymru lawr I de orllewin Lloegr a rhanna o gorllewin Ffrainc a Gogledd Sbaen. Nwch chi ffeindio nhw o gwmpas y môr du a'r môr Caspian yn y dwyrain canol chi, a wedyn yn dwyrain Asia a rhanna o Australasia. A beth sy'n nodweddu coedlanna yma chi, beth sydd yn debyg rhwng nhw I gyd mewn ffordd, maen nhw'n cael glawiad blynyddol cymedrol I ychal chi, so llefydd eitha wlyb. Tymheredd blynyddol cyfartalog cymharol gyson heb llawer o amrywiad tymhorol. Hynny ydy, dydyn nhw'n cael gaeafan a hafan eithafol neu teri beidio, maen nhw'n eitha cyson chi. A maen nhw'n cynefino gyfeithog, andros o gyfeithog o ran baiamrywiaeth bywyd gwyllt, ewedig cymunedau o isplanhigion, cennau, brifitau, musogla a ffwngi ymysg eraill chi. Felly, jyst chydig bach gefndir am y prosiect. So, prosiect sydd wedi ariannu trwy cynllun natur a bioamrywiaeth LIFE, sef y Comisiwn Ewropeaidd. So, mae prosiect wedi gyfanrwy werth o gwmpas 9 miliwn a hanner euro, neu 7 miliwn a hanner o bunnoedd, dibynnu ar y exchange rate ar y pryd chi. Mae 60% o'r arian yna dod o'r Comisiwn Ewropeaidd. Wedyn mae'r 40% arall dod o amryw o bartneriaid, sôn am hynny yn y sleid nesaf. Da ni'n cael 2 miliwn o mewnbwn gan Llywodraeth Cymru. Dwi'n ddiolchgar iawn am hynny. Mi gychwynnodd prosiect yn Awst 2018 yn swyddogol chi, ac fel mae pethau ar y funud, fydd o'n mynd tan Gorffennaf 2025. So mae'n eitha unigryw yn hyd y prosiect mewn ffordd anamal iawn. Gewch chi prosiectau cadwraethol sy'n para 7 mlynedd. Mae hynny'n adlewyrchiad wrach o faint o waith gynnon ni wneud a'r techneg da ni defnyddio i rheoli rhododendron. Mae'n fod o'n cymryd 3 cam o gwaith. Mae rhaid i ni spredio nhw allan dros cyfnod eitha hir mewn ffordd sydd yn golygu bod ni wedi gallu cyfiawnhau i gael prosiect 7 mlynedd o hyd. Felly, partneriaid, so'r buddiolwyr ydy ni, Awdurdod Parc Cenedlaethol, ni sydd yn arwain ar y prosiect. Mae gennych chi hefyd staff prosiect wedi lleoli efo RSPB Cymru, ac oedd Cadw, Woodland Trust. Mae partneriaid eraill neu hyd-ariannwyr mewn ffordd, Cyfoeth Naturiol Cymru, Dŵr Cymru, a fel nes I sôn yn y sleid cynt, cyfraniad ariannol mawr yn dod gan Llywodraeth Cymru i'r prosiect. Mae o'n prosiect ledled Cymru, Pan Wales Project, yn gorchuddio 5 ardal o gadwraeth arbennig. Felly, yn y gogledd orllewin, yn Eryri mewn ffordd, mae'n cynnwys danna deheuol Sac Eryri, a wedyn fel gadwraeth arbennig Erw Meirionnydd. Jyst i'r de o Machynlleth, mae gennych chi Coed Cwmeinion. Mae gennych chi wedyn i'r gorllewin o Rhaeadr, Cwmelan, Elen Valley Woodland Sac, a wedyn ar y ffin rhwng Ceredigion a Sir Gar, mae gennych chi Sac Cwm Doethia, Mynydd Mallain. Felly heina di'r 5 ardal gadwraeth arbennig da ni'n ffocysu ar, gyd yn rhannu nodwedd wrth gwrs Cynefin, H1 80 dwi'n meddwl, Coed Lanna Derw, a hefyd chydig bach o Cynefin 91A0, sef y Tiliosirian Woodlands of Slopes, Screes and Ravines. Mae yna 4 uwch amcan, os liciwch chi'r prosiect. Yr un gyntaf ydy rheoli a gwaredu rhywogaethau ymledol yn bennaf Rhododendron Ponticum o fewn y coedlanna, o fewn y sac, ond hefyd o'r ardal bwffer o gwmpas y sac. Y syniad tu ôl I hynny wrth gwrs ydy os da chi'n cael gwarad o ffynhonnau llad, yna mi wneith o ddim dod yn ôl mewn i'r coedlanna dymor. Cyd-fynd efo hwnnw wedyn, mae rhaid ni gynhyrchu a lledaenu pecyn cymorth sydd danos y dull 3 cam o rheoli Rhododendron Ponticum, fel o'n I sôn mewn sleid cynt. Da ni'n gweithio techneg o rheoli Rhododendron 3 cam sydd yn para 5 mlynedd, a dyna pam bod gynnon ni 7 mlynedd o hyd mae i'r prosiect I alluogi ni I weithredu'r dull 3 cam yma dros cyfnod o sawl blwyddyn mewn ffordd. Wedi cyd-fynd efo hwnnw wedyn, mae rhaid ni wneud digwyddiadau ar ddanos, nid yn unig ar elfen rhododendron o'r prosiect, ond hefyd yr elfen pori a'r rheoli coedlanna hynafol. Codi ymwybyddiaeth o'r Cynefin ymysg gynulleidfa eang, so dwi'n meddwl bod hyn yn rhywbeth mae Life yn licio gweld o gyd o'i prosiectau ydy y trafod na ar codi ymwybyddiaeth a'r networking rhwng y prosiect a audiences. Cymraeg allan, a prosiectau eraill mewn ffordd, a bod yna lot o dysgu yn ôl ymlaen hwn y prosiectau yna. Pedwerydd amcan ydy cyflwyno porthaethol, safleoedd cwytir penodol, a mae hwn wedyn afol. Fel da chi'n dychmygu, mae lot o'r amcanion y prosiect yn plethu. Hwn ydy'r amcan fyddwn ni'n sôn benodol amdano fo heddiw. Prosiect mor eang, a dyn ni'n sôn am pob dim. Felly da ni'n ffocysu ar y elfen pori o'r prosiect. A wan fydda i reis i drysodd i Helen y swyddog pori fydd yn rhoi bach mwy o flas i chi o be fydda ni'n neud o'r ochr pori o fewn y prosiect. Helen.
Diolch, Gethin. I'll be continuing in English. I see we've had a little trouble with some of the technical stuff. So, why conservation grazing? So this project spent a lot of time in development. It was several years, various versions of the project. During that time, it was moulded by investigations and things like comprehensive lichen surveys, and they were done by independent experts and by organisations such as Plant Life and Pont. And overall, it found that grazing-related factors were driving an unfavourable SAC condition. So in this case, favourable looks like an open, airy canopy with lots of light reaching the lichens and bryophytes. And in most cases, these sites were unfavourable, because of excessive scrub and vigorous plants, which would cast shade and block airflow. So where these sites are, we have about 300 hectares that need grazing management specifically, and I tend to group them into about 15 sites, because although some are smaller blocks, we're thinking of working on a landscape scale and having management that is coherent across several sites. In some cases, the sites are quite isolated nature reserves, and in other cases we have them on tenant farms, or we have them adjacent to farms, so we're trying to incorporate them into the farming regime. They are mixed private ownership and NGO ownership, so some are RSPB reserves. They all lie within the SAC, and most are also designated SSSI, so it's quite tightly regulated what we can do, quite heavily protected. So this shows one of the rare sites that is actually overgrazed at the moment. So you can see there's not much happening on the ground flora. The bracken you can see at the front is where there's a road cutting through, so that's where the only light is coming through. This is kind of a contrast to what I've just mentioned about it being usually undergrazed. And this traces back quite a lot to mid-century land use. So we have a kind of history over the last centuries of the actual woodland management. And then about mid-century, there was a focus on pushing for food production. And at this point, many woodlands were overgrazed and might look a bit like this. So in about the 1980s, it was recognised that this threatened the future of the woodlands. You can see there's no saplings coming through, there's nothing to replace these trees when they get old. So what we did, in our wisdom, was fence them off and leave them to regenerate. And this also excluded any of the wild herbivores, so maybe deer, maybe feral goats, that would otherwise come in and graze. And what's happened then is most vigorous plants like bramble have come in and swamped the smaller and more specialised ones. So now really we're at the point of trying to rebalance. What we want is enough young saplings coming through to be the veterans of the future, but the habitat as a whole needs quite a bit of work. And grazing in particular is quite a gentle way to introduce this. So you could come in with strimmers and chainsaws and brush cutters, and in some cases we do need quite substantial intervention. But grazing you can bring in slowly over months and over years, and you've got time to adjust as you go along. You've got lots of time to monitor. And also the animals bring other benefits to the site. So you produce dung for invertebrate populations, you leave fur around for nesting birds, and they bring in kind of the unexpected. So perhaps they're making tracks to a favourite lying spot, or they're rubbing on rocks and trees and having a kind of different physical impact. Finally, in terms of sustainability and resilient landscapes, producing modest amounts of high quality meat is an incentive to continue managing these woodlands. And if you contrast that with time and fossil fuel and artificial inputs that would otherwise be needed if you're using machinery, that's much different. This just shows that obviously Highland cattle are really, really good. We know they browse happily, but this photo in particular shows them acting as if they're going to raise the crown of this young tree, which again increases the light levels coming through to the tree trunk itself and to the ground underneath. And this ties in with growing understanding of the role of trees in things like agroforestry and the role of browsing in healthy livestock diets. And it's helping rediscover this lost traditional knowledge. And one of my favourite things is supporting native breeds, of course. So we do have a short video for you next. After that, we'll return to Hilary's slides. And I'll just warn you before we start that we did our best to level out the sound, but there might be some variation in the volume of the speakers. So just be aware of that. Okay, and we're ready for the video. Thank you.
So we're out here today on this lovely autumn morning in Coed Garth. It's an RSPB reserve at the northern slopes of the Mawddach estuary. We're currently stood just above the woodland edge on an area of freed habitat. The reserve largely falls within the boundaries of the Meirionnydd Oakwoods and Batsite Sack and is a good example of the Celtic rainforest habitat. We'll be taking you on a mini tour through the woodland here at Coed Garth and a nearby National Trust owned woodland at Ganchwyd, Coed Dolmalunllyn. We'll discuss the different aspects of conservation grazing that have been introduced to these sites, either through the Life Celtic Rainforest Wales project or previously. This area of woodland at Coed Garth is one which is yet to be grazed by the Highland cattle, and is a good example of what you'd expect to find in a woodland where grazing is needed. The understory and ground layer are dominated by dense bramble and bracken, which hinders the development of a diverse ground flora, including natural regen. In addition, it can shade many of the surfaces on which low plant communities thrive, such as the bark of the mature trees, further impacting on the conservation value of the woodlands. This woodland at Dolmalunllyn, Ganchwyd, which we'll visit again later in the video, has had grazing on it for some years now, and is a good example of what we wish to achieve. It retains a fairly open canopy, which although is currently fairly even aged, possibly as a result of previous management, shows signs of recovery with healthy amounts of natural regen and a varied age structure in the lower canopy. The ground layer retains a small amount of bramble and bracken, but the grazing has largely suppressed these such that they no longer pose a threat to flowering plants and saplings, nor do they shade the rocky surfaces and tree bark, which often provides the best substrate for lower plant communities.
Okay, so what we're looking at here is a decent sort of stepping stone, a halfway point. So we've got the nice mature sessile oaks, they've got room for the canopy going up above them. There is a little bit too much regeneration underneath, there's a little bit too much holly, a little bit too much bramble and bracken. Most of that should be looked after with the cattle, because what we're aiming for again is a nice open woodland with lots of air and lots of light. So this section of the woodland at Coed Garth is currently not grazed under Glassdeer rules, but what we've done is, with an eye to the future, install the new infrastructure while we have funding so that we can go ahead and graze that if and when that becomes appropriate. And the benefit of our project being able to invest like this is to restore things like traditional stone walling. So we're using local craftsmen, local employers, and hopefully this will still be standing for hundreds of years now.
When we're grazing a site with public access, it's important to have livestock that are fairly chilled and won't be spooked by visitors or frighten them. Signage is essential to inform people that there are livestock on site and explain why they're there for wildlife and habitat benefit and how to behave around them. We need to make sure people don't feed the animals and that dogs are kept on leads and less threatened. Pont has held events for local walkers on some sites to explain how to behave, which can be really helpful.
So on some sites where we need to have a stock-proof external boundary, we will use standard stock netting and possibly barbed wire. However, on internal divisions, we want to not act as a barrier for wildlife. So we've chosen plain high tensile wire here. It allows wildlife free access, but enables us to manage the cattle within the site.
A lot of our time goes into finding the right contractors. Most of our sites are very inaccessible. We're looking for people with the skills and who are happy to come and carry lots of fence posts onto some very inaccessible sites and working on some very steep ground, some very rocky ground. And it's not the usual job that these guys would normally be doing. It's also really important to keep in touch with them. So here you can see we've decided to move a gate because we uncovered an existing gap in the stone wall. I feel it's also really important that contractors can come to us and say if there's a problem, if they don't quite understand what we're asking them to do, because in some cases we're both learning as we go along. And you can appreciate some of the skill needed and determination to be able to restore walls across water and through bogs and up hills, and I think it's very much worth the effort. This is fairly typical of a lot of the sites we're working on in the project. So you can see there's plenty of trees, there's a lot of undergrowth, so we've got lots of bramble, usually some bracken in open areas, lots of smaller trees regenerating, and you can see that there's not much light getting through to the trees and there is no light getting through to any ground flora at all. This is what all of the investment is about. So we've reintroduced large herbivore grazing to Coed Geth, and in this particular compartment these two have been here for about 3 or 4 days when we took this video. They've previously been on another site nearby. Now, Highland cattle have proven themselves to be really good at this job. They're small and quite easy to handle. They thrive on eating the brambles that you can see here, and they browse as well, so they take ivy and they take some of the very small saplings, and they actually have a habit of pushing over some saplings as well, which makes the structure of the wood a lot more interesting. And these two, we've got Deru, who is the black one on the left, and Katie is the red one on the right. And Deru's just demonstrating as well how they will happily push through areas of bramble and undergrowth, start making some tracks through, and start opening up the ground layer to let light through to the soil underneath. One of the challenges of conservation grazing in general is that we usually use quite low numbers and low densities of animals. So we could have 4 animals over 10 or so hectares. And one of the costs associated with this is the amount of time it takes for the livestock keeper to come and check on them every day. So what we have, and what you might see on Deru here, is a GPS collar, and this connects by mobile phone signal to an app which enables the grazier or myself to look up where the animal is and where they've been in the last 24 hours, and it can also be set to send an alert in the case of any potential escape. So any sort of new technology we can trial to show that this is, a pattern of grazing that can be sustained into the future is one of the outcomes of the project we want to promote.
It's really good to see the cattle here now. You can see how they're moving through the woodland, trampling bracken, making paths and browsing the bramble and the regen, which improves the airflow through the wood to benefit the lichens and open it out for birds such as the pied flycatcher. The results they achieve will be monitored in terms of vegetation structure and diversity, and then they'll be moved onto the next compartment once we're happy with this one. It's a continual process of assessment and tweaking management throughout the coming years.
You can see Daru's GPS collar a lot more clearly from this angle, and as you can see, he's not bothered by it at all. We do go in and make sure that the strap isn't rubbing and that it's fitting well and that it won't get snagged on any trees as he's wandering around.
So this is our phoenix tree, and in the storms last winter it was blown over just after we'd repaired the stone walling next to it. So our warden was able to kind of cut the path through whilst keeping it safe, and you can see the limbs there are supporting the weight of the tree, and there's enough of the root plate left attached for it to carry on and grow. So all we did really was rebuild the wall, pop some fence in, and then fill in the gap underneath where the roots have come up so that people and animals can't fall down and get hurt, and hopefully it will keep growing for hundreds more years. So this area of Coed Gathgeth is also really valuable habitat, and you can see behind us the woodland edge sort of comes into this wetland area, and we know that edgeland habitats are really important for various species of bird and other wildlife on site. But we found that when we're talking about support for land management, woodland is often treated as its own separate entity and it's not incorporated into the wider landscape. Could you tell us a bit more?
Well, under single farm payment rules, there is no payment for woodland. But actually, as you're saying, Helen, it's part of the farm and part of the natural environment, and grazing in woodlands can be a really important management tool. So if in future environmental schemes, as they replace single farm payment, they could include management of woodlands by grazing and using livestock, that would just be amazing. It would really improve the future for funding work in woodlands. This area of wet heath with Molinia, purple moorgrass, heather and bilberry is great for butterflies and a host of other wildlife. The woodland edge around it provides valuable habitat for a wide range of birds, reptiles and insects, as well as dormice. Transition habitats such as this have a greater number of species and a density of species than the habitats on either side. The cattle will help to manage the edge by creating good vegetation structure, and they'll also be browsing Molinia between late April and August. It's most nutritious then, but it will still be eaten into the winter. They'll break up the Molinia thatch as they walk around the area and leave a diverse sward for flowers and access for other species.
It's important to remember that grazing and browsing isn't the only impact that the cattle have. So here we can see some of the dung they've left behind. This is the start of a food web for lots of invertebrates and birds and small mammals as well. And you can also see the impact they've had on the bracken and the small trees just around us. Now this area of freed land is in itself a valuable habitat, so it's where the edge of the woodland gradually feathers into this upland heathery area. And what we'd be looking for here over the next few years is much more heather being visible, still some trees, this is freed, and then a vast reduction in the amount of bracken on the ground. And so far so good.
Around 1,000 beetle species can be found in the woodland, breeding in decaying wood and feeding on sap, leaves and each other. Cattle dung can support up to 250 different types of invertebrate, including dung beetles, which feed, breed and hunt in and below the cowpats, providing food for a host of creatures further up the food chain. It's important to make sure the cattle are not treated with ivermectin wormers before or during their grazing on conservation sites.
So we've moved slightly downslope of where we were up on the heath a little earlier now, and we're moving into the woodland itself. This is a woodland where we've had grazing now for about 6 months, and as you can see, compared to some of the other examples where we haven't had grazing, there's a distinct lack of bramble on the ground layer here. If you'd have been here a few months ago, it was a lot more dense, so it does show the impact the cattle have or have had, and what we would envisage seeing over the next season or two is a more diverse ground flora coming back, and then in a longer period more regen coming through compared to those areas where grazing hasn't been undertaken.
This area has a bit of a head start when it comes to the grazing. So previous management has included some chainsaw work to thin the trees. There's been a substantial amount of work with brush cutters and strimmers to knock back the bramble and the bracken and the undergrowth. So it's getting a lot closer to what we're aiming for. Interestingly, if you look to the right of the screen, you'll see the ivy has been stripped from that tree trunk, and that's about the height the Highland cattle can reach. So they've been in here about a year, and they've eaten the regeneration of the bramble. Like I say, they've stripped some of the ivy, they've kept the grass short on the paths, and hopefully this means that we won't need to use machinery in here often, if at all. And if you think about the savings in fossil fuel and time of the wardens and travel time of the wardens to here, I think that's a very good situation to be in.
We're now at Coed Dolmolynllyn, Ganllwyd, some 4 miles northeast of Coed Garth, where we were earlier. The site has been in the ownership of the National Trust since 1936, having previously formed part of the Dolmolynllyn estate. The woodland is classified as ancient woodland, having been under continuous forestry cover since at least 1600, and is split in two by the Afon Gamlan, one of the most important ravines in Western Europe for oceanic bryophytes. Similar to an earlier scene in the video, this clip of the woodland at Dolmolynllyn provides a good example of what we want to achieve in some of the woodlands through introduced grazing. The highlands help keep levels of bramble and bracken down, allowing for a much more diverse ground flora to develop and regen to thrive. Although not the best time of year to capture flowering plants, we would expect species such as bluebells, primrose, wood sorrel and violets to be present in the spring and summer months, alongside a diversity of lower plants and native saplings, which you can see in the scene. Some of the species of lichens that we find in Celtic rainforests are globally rare. Here we have Lobelia pulmonaria, or tree lungwort, and a stigda lichen. These, along with some other mainly leafy looking lichens, are referred to as a Loberian lichen community. It's these lichen communities that help to make Celtic rainforest habitats of international importance. This tree lungwort is a particularly striking example given its large green leafy structure. All lichens are in fact two organisms, an alga and a fungi. The alga need light to photosynthesize, which is why we aim to manage our woodlands to ensure the open structure we have mentioned previously. Each species of lichen also needs their own perfect level of humidity in order to thrive. Our high rainfall, steep rocky gorges, and a closed canopy combine to create these humid conditions. And so to summarise, by looking to replicate what would historically be a natural occurrence, sustainable grazing can be a highly valued conservation tool. It can be used to manage levels of more undesirable species in the low canopy and ground layers of native woodlands, in doing so allowing for much greater diversity of flowering plants, lower plants and tree saplings to thrive.
I hope you all enjoyed that film. So I'll just carry on with the presentation now. So there's an opportunity now with the development of the new Welsh Government Farming Support Scheme to fund woodland management using grazing livestock, including woodland within the land eligible for management payments, and accepting that livestock can be beneficial in the woodland when they're managed carefully and appropriately. Any scheme's got to recognise that every site is different and allow for flexibility of management. Pulse grazing, low stocking rates, different timings of grazing and types of livestock based on local knowledge and the experience of managers can be used as suits each individual woodland. If the aims of grazing are well understood and the results are monitored as we go along, we should be able to incentivise the grazing through both making support payments available and the market for high quality wildlife friendly produce.
Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you very much. That's the end of the presentation. Thank you for everybody who's asked questions. We are trying to go through them. Yeah, diolch yn fawr iawn. And if you've got any questions about the project or interested in hearing more, then please contact either Helen or myself. There is a generic email. I think it's post@coedwigoedglawceltaidd.cymru. It's all on our website, so please visit. And yeah, any further questions, then please contact us directly, and we'll do our best to answer those questions. Diolch.
Lovely, diolch yn fawr iawn.